A bishop is a piece in the board game of chess. Each player begins the game with two bishops. One starts between the king's knight and the king, the other between the queen's knight and the queen. In algebraic notation, the starting squares are c1 and f1 for white's bishops, and c8 and f8 for black's bishops. Movement: the bishop has no restrictions in distance for each move, but is limited to diagonal movement. Bishops, like all other pieces except the knight, cannot jump over other pieces. A bishop captures by occupying the square on which an enemy piece sits. The bishops may be differentiated according to which wing they begin on, that is the king's bishop and queen's bishop. As a consequence of its diagonal movement, each bishop always remains on either the white or black squares, and so it is also common to refer to them as light-squared or dark-squared bishops. History: the bishop's predecessor in shatranj was the alfil, meaning the elephant, which could leap two squares along any diagonal, and could jump over an intervening piece. As a consequence, each fil was restricted to 8 squares, and no fil could attack another. The modern bishop first appeared shortly after 1200 in courier chess. A piece with this move, called a cocatras or crocodile, is part of the Grand Asadrex in the game book compiled in 1283 for King Alfonso X of Castile. The game is attributed to India, then a very vague term. About half a century later, Muhyiddin Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Mulla, in his Treasury of the Sciences, describes an expanded form of chess with two pieces moving like the rook but obliquely. Derivatives of alfil survive in the languages of the two countries where chess were first introduced within Western Europe: Euro-Italian and Spanish. It was known as the orphin in French, or the orphin, alfin, or archer in early English. The term bishop first entered the English language in the 16th century, with the first known written example dating back to 1560s. In all other Germanic languages, except for Icelandic, it is called various names, all of which directly translate to English as runner, or messenger. In Romanian, it is known as nebun, which refers to a crazy person, which is most likely derived from fuduroi, a jester. In Icelandic, however, it is called biskup, with the same meaning as in English. Interestingly, the use of the term in Icelandic predates that of the English language, as the first mentioning of biskup in Icelandic texts dates back to the early part of the 14th century, while the 12th century Lewis chessmen portray the bishop as an unambiguously ecclesiastical figure. In the saga of Earl Magnus, which was written in Iceland somewhere between 1300 to 1325, it is described how an emperor was checkmated by a bishop. This has led to some speculations as to the origin of the English use of the term bishop. The canonical chessmen date back to the Staunton chess set of 1849. The piece's deep groove symbolizes a bishop's mitre. Some have written that the groove originated from the original form of the piece, an elephant with the groove representing the elephant's tusks. The British chose to call the piece a bishop because the projections at the top resembled a mitre. This groove was interpreted differently in different countries as the game moved to Europe. In France, for example, the groove was taken to be a jester's cap, hence in France the bishop is called fou. In some Slavic languages the bishop is called star and registered trademark Strelic, which directly translates to English as a shooter meaning an archer, while in others it is still known as elephant. In South Slavic languages it is usually known as Lovak, meaning hunter, or Läufer, taken from the German name for the same piece. An alternative name for bishop in Russian is officer. Name translations equals, the original name of the bishop was elephant. Comparison to other pieces. Versus rook equals, a rook is generally worth about 2 pawns more than a bishop. The bishop has access to only half of the squares on the board, whereas all squares of the board are accessible to the rook. On an empty board, a rook always attacks 14 squares, whereas a bishop attacks no more than 13 and sometimes as few as 7, depending on how near it is to the center. Also, a king and rook can force checkmate against a lone king, while a king and bishop cannot. Versus knight equals, in general bishops are approximately equal in strength to knights, but depending on the game situation either may have a distinct advantage. Less experienced players tend to underrate the bishop compared to the knight because the knight can reach all squares and is more adept at forking. More experienced players understand the power of the bishop. Bishops usually gain in relative strength towards the endgame as more pieces are captured and more open lines become available on which they can operate. A bishop can easily influence both wings simultaneously, whereas a knight is less capable of doing so. In an open endgame, a pair of bishops is decidedly superior to either a bishop and a knight, or two knights. A player possessing a pair of bishops is a strategic weapon in the form of a long-term threat to trade down to an advantageous endgame. Two bishops versus king can force checkmate, whereas two knights cannot. A bishop and knight can force mate, but with far greater difficulty than two bishops. In certain positions a bishop can by itself lose a move, while a knight can never do so. The bishop is capable of skewering or pinning a piece, while the knight can do neither. A bishop can in some situations hinder a knight from moving. In these situations, the bishop is said to be dominating the knight. On the other hand, in the opening and middle game a bishop may be hemmed in by pawns of both players, and thus be inferior to a knight which can hop over them. Furthermore, on a crowded board a knight has many tactical opportunities to fork two enemy pieces. A bishop can fork, but opportunities are more rare. One such example occurs in the position at right, which arises from the Raul Lopez, 1e4 e5 2 nf3 and c6 3 bb5 a6 4 bar 4 nf6 5.0-0 b5 6 bb3 b7 7 d4 d6 8 c3 bg4 9 h3 bxf3 10 qxf3 exd4 11 qg3 g6 12 bh6. Game use equals good bishop and bad bishop equals. In the middle game, a player with only one bishop should generally place his pawns on squares of the color that the bishop cannot move to. This allows the player to control squares of both colors, allows the bishop to move freely among the pawns, and helps fix enemy pawns on squares on which they can be attacked by the bishop. Such a bishop is often referred to as a good bishop. Conversely, a bishop which is impeded by friendly pawns is often referred to as a bad bishop. The black light-squared bishop in the French defense is a notorious example of this concept. However, a bad bishop need not always be a weakness, especially if it is outside its own pawn chains. In addition, having a bad bishop may be advantageous in an opposite-colored bishop's endgame. Even if the bad bishop is passively placed, it may serve a useful defensive function. A well-known quip from GMI Isaba is that bad bishops protect good pawns. In the position from the game Krasenkow vs Svajintsev, a thicket of black pawns hems in black's bishop on c8, so black is effectively playing with one piece fewer than white. Although the black pawns also obstruct the white bishop on e2, it has many more attacking possibilities, and thus is a good bishop vis-a-vis black's bad bishop. Black resigned after another 10 moves. Fianchetto equals. A bishop may be fianchettoed, for example after moving the g2 pawn to g3 and the bishop on f1 to g2. This can form a strong defense for the castled king on g1 and the bishop can often exert strong pressure on a long diagonal. A fianchettoed bishop should generally not be given up lightly, since the resulting holes in the pawn formation may prove to be serious weaknesses, particularly if the king has castled on that side of the board. There are nonetheless some modern opening lines where a fianchettoed bishop is given up for a knight in order to double the opponent's pawns, for example 1 d4 g6 2 c4 bg7 3 nc3 c5 4 d5 bx c3 plus 5 bx c3 f5, a sharp line originated by Roman Zinzikashvili. Giving up a fianchettoed queen bishop for a knight is usually less problematic. For example, in Karpov v Brown, San Antonio 1972, after 1 c4 c5 2 b3 nf6 3 bb2 g6. Karpov gave up his fianchettoed bishop with 4 bxf6. Exf6 5 nc3, doubling black's pawns and giving him a hole on d5. Endgame equals, an endgame in which each player has only one bishop, one controlling the dark squares and the other the light, will often result in a draw even if one player has a pawn or sometimes two more than the other. the players tend to gain control of squares of opposite colors, and a deadlock results. In endgames with same-colored bishops, however, even a positional advantage may be enough to win. Bishops on opposite colors. Endgames in which each player has only one bishop and the bishops are on opposite colors are often drawn, even when one side has an extra pawn or two. Many of these positions would be a win if the bishops were on the same color. The position from Wolf vs. Lenhart shows an important defensive setup. Black can make no progress, since the white bishop ties the black king to defending the pawn on g4 and it also prevents the advance. f3+ because it would simply capture the pawn then either the other pawn is exchanged for the bishop or the pawn advances. Otherwise the bishop alternates between the squares d1 and e2. If two pawns are connected, they normally win if they reach their 6th rank, otherwise the game may be a draw. If two pawns are separated by one file they usually draw, but win if they are farther apart. In some cases with more pawns on the board, it is actually advantageous to have the bishops on opposite colors if one side has weak pawns. In the 1925 game of FM Bogoljubov vs Max Bla 1/4 Mich, white wins because of the bishops being on opposite colors making black weak on the black squares, the weakness of black's isolated pawns on the queen side, and the weak doubled pawns on the king side. The game continued, 29. Kd do k7, 30. Kc3 f6, 31. Kd4 b6, 32. Kc5 kd7, 33. Kb6 g5, 34. Kxa6 kc7, 35. bb6 plus kc8, 36 bc5 kc7, 37. bf8 f5, 38. bx g7 f4, 39. bf6 f3, 40 gx f3 ex f3, 41. bx g5 bx h3, 42. bf4 plus 1-0. Wrong bishop. In an endgame with a bishop, in some cases the bishop is the wrong bishop, meaning that it is on the wrong color of square for some purpose. For example, with just a bishop and a rook pawn, if the bishop cannot control the promotion square of the pawn, it is said to be the wrong bishop, or the pawn is said to be the wrong rook pawn. This results in some positions being drawn which otherwise would be won. Unicode. Unicode defines two code points for bishop, an unregistered trademark, U+2657 white chess bishop, an unregistered trademark U+265D black chess bishop. See also. Notes. References, Barden, Leonard, Play Better Chess with Leonard Barden, Octopus Books Limited, pages 10, ISBN 978-0-7134-8769-5, Brace, Edward R., An Illustrated Dictionary of Chess, Hamlin Publishing Group, pages 34-35, ISBN 1-55521-394-4, Davidson, Henry, A Short History of Chess, Mackay, ISBN 0-679-14550-8, Fine, Ruben. Benko, Pal, Basic Chess Endings, Mackay, ISBN 0-8129-3493-8, Fisk, Willard, Chess in Iceland and in Icelandic Literature, with historical notes on other table games, The Florentine Typographical Society, Golombek, Harry, Chess, A History, Putnam, ISBN 0-399-11575-7, Hooper, David. Wild, Kenneth, The Oxford Companion to Chess, Oxford University Press, ISBN 0-19-280049-3, Kerstoffer, Peter, The Everything Chess Basics Book, Adams Media, ISBN 978-1-58062-586-9, Midneys, Edmar, Practical Bishop Endings, Chess Enterprises, ISBN 0-945470-04-5, Marwan Courtelaire, Carson. Lamprecht, Frank, Fundamental Chess Endings, Gambit Publications, ISBN 1-900-1983-53-6, Murray, H.J.R., A History of Chess, Oxford University Press, Reinfeldt, Fred, Reinfeldt on the Endgame in Chess, Dover Publications.